You know what your problem is, Claire. You've always thought you were smarter than you actually are. The numbers don't lie. I do. He said that at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning in March, with both of his parents sitting 3 feet away, our daughter eating cereal at the counter behind me, and our accountant, a man named Dale Fitch, who had driven 40 minutes to our house that morning, holding a printed spreadsheet that would, within 8 months, become Exhibit 14 in a federal civil proceeding. 31 years old, married for 7 years. The daughter of a woman who once told me that a quiet wife was a wise wife. My name is Claire Maddox. This is the story of how I found $1. 4 million I never knew existed, and how the man who hid it lost everything he thought he'd protected. By the time he finished that sentence, I had already started. If any part of this story feels familiar, if you've ever sat at a table where someone rewrote the truth and called it love, I'd be glad if you stayed. Leave a thought below. It helps more than you know. The house on Linden Creek Road. The house was beautiful. That's the first thing anyone said about it. And it's still the first thing I say, because beauty matters when you're trying to understand how something so wrong could go unnoticed for so long. It was a 4-bedroom Craftsman on Linden Creek Road in Marwick, Ohio. A town of about 22,000 people, old enough to have a hardware store that still mixed paint by hand, small enough that the woman at the post office knew your middle name. The house had a wide front porch with original columns painted in a shade called antique ivory, a kitchen that had been renovated in 2009 with white oak cabinets and honed marble counters, and a mudroom that still smelled faintly of cedar from the closet organizer we installed the second summer. I loved that house. I want to say that clearly. Whatever the house became later, evidence, argument, asset, I loved it first. Daniel Maddox and I moved in during October of 2015, 3 months after our wedding. We were 31 and 33. He was a financial operations manager at a regional logistics company called Holt Brennan Supply, a position he'd held for 4 years, and described with the satisfied confidence of a man who had exactly what he planned for. I was a licensed occupational therapist, with a caseload split between a pediatric clinic in Marwick and home visits for elderly patients in 2 surrounding counties. We had one daughter, Emma, who had been born 8 months before the wedding. Not a scandal in 2015, though Daniel's mother, Patrice, found a way to mention the sequence of events roughly once a season for the next 6 years. Patrice Maddox, she deserves her own paragraph. She was a retired school administrator who wore blazers to casual dinners and kept a framed photograph of Daniel's college graduation on the living room mantel of her condo in Findlay. She was not cruel in any theatrical sense. She was precise. She communicated disapproval through calibrated silences, through the way she moved her food around a plate when she didn't like what had been cooked, through questions that were not questions. Did you consider putting Emma in Montessori? Delivered with the patient curiosity of someone who already knew the answer you should have given. She had a son who was, in her understanding of the world, exceptional. And she had, unfortunately, acquired a daughter-in-law who was merely competent. Daniel's father, Robert Maddox, was a semi-retired civil engineer who had spent 30 years doing municipal drainage work and had the quiet, lateral stillness of a man who had long ago decided that domestic peace required him to have no opinions. He laughed at his wife's jokes. He complimented her cooking. He occasionally caught my eye across the dinner table with an expression I could never fully read. Not apology, not complicity, something in between. Like a man watching a storm through a window he'd decided not to open. My own family was smaller and more scattered. My mother, Donna Reyes, lived in Akron, 40 minutes east. She was a retired medical billing specialist, widowed when I was 19, practical to the point of bluntness, and the only person in my life who had ever looked at Daniel Maddox with openly unimpressed eyes. She came to Linden Creek Road for holidays and birthday parties and left before the dishes were done. And when I called her afterward, she always asked the same question, "Are you okay, Claire?" Not "How was it?" Not "How's Daniel?" just "Are you okay?" I told her yes every time. She didn't always believe me. The structure of our household finances was established in the first month of our marriage and never revisited. Daniel handled everything. He had a background in financial operations. He was, by his own frequent description, good with money in a way most people aren't. Our joint checking account received both of our paychecks by direct deposit. Daniel managed the mortgage, the utilities, the car payments, the insurance premiums, and our investment accounts. I had a debit card linked to the joint account and a Visa with a $3,000 limit that I used for groceries, gas, and incidentals. Once a month, Daniel would tell me what the account balance was. He gave me numbers. He did not give me access. I want to be careful here, because I've thought about this arrangement for a long time since I was not naive. I was not, by any reasonable measure, a woman who did not understand money. I managed billing codes and insurance authorizations for a medical practice. I filed my own taxes before we were married, but I was 31 years old and newly married to a man who was confident and organized, and who presented himself as someone doing me a favor by managing the complexity. And I had been raised, quietly and persistently, to believe that a harmonious marriage was one in which certain decisions were not contested. My mother had tried to tell me otherwise. I hadn't heard her. That first year on Linden Creek Road was, by every external measure, good. We had dinner parties. Emma took her first steps in the hallway between the kitchen and the living room. Daniel was promoted to Senior Financial Operations Manager, with a salary increase to $112,000 annually. I picked up 3 additional home visit clients and raised my annual earnings to $67,000. We went to the Outer Banks in July, and I have photographs of the 4 of us, including Patrice, who came along standing on a pier at sunset that look exactly like what they were. A family at its most convincingly intact. I didn't know yet what I was looking at. The first scene I need to describe happened in November of 2016, 14 months after we moved into the house. We were at Patrice and Robert's condo in Findlay for Thanksgiving. There were 19 people in that condo. Daniel's sister Bethany and her husband Greg, their 3 kids, Robert's brother Carl and his wife, a neighbor named Suzanne, who came every year because her husband had died and Patrice believed in keeping the chair full, and various cousins I could never keep straight. I had made a sweet potato casserole from a recipe my mother had given me, which I had made successfully 4 times before. I brought it in a covered dish and set it on the kitchen counter when we arrived. Patrice looked at it. She lifted the corner of the foil. She set it back down. "We usually do the sweet potatoes without the topping," she said. "Robert has a sensitivity." I had been making sweet potato casserole with a brown sugar and pecan topping for my entire adult life. Robert had eaten it at my mother's house the previous Christmas without any apparent reaction, but I said, "Of course I'll remember for next time," and I carried the dish to the far end of the buffet table where it sat, largely untouched, for the rest of the evening. At the dinner table, while we were passing dishes, Patrice said to the table at large, to all 19 of us, "Daniel tells me you've been having some trouble keeping up with the housework since your caseload expanded. Don't be afraid to ask for help, Claire. We can always send someone over." I felt the specific heat that climbs the back of your neck when something humiliating is happening in front of people who are pretending not to notice. Bethany was looking at her plate. Greg was looking at Daniel. Daniel was buttering a roll. "We're managing fine," I said. "Of course you are," said Patrice, in the tone that meant, "No, you aren't." I let it go. That was my first mistake, or rather, the first mistake I recognized clearly enough to name. The second scene happened in the spring of 2018. Emma was 3. Daniel had mentioned, in the abstract way he sometimes floated ideas, that he'd been thinking about whether I should reduce my caseload. "Not quit," he said. "Just scale back. You're stretched thin. Emma needs more of you." I told him I wasn't stretched thin. I told him I loved my work and that Emma was doing well in her part-time preschool. He nodded, in the way that meant the conversation was being filed, not closed. 3 weeks later, at a dinner at Linden Creek Road with Patrice and Robert present, the subject came up again. I don't know if it was planned. I've thought about it since and I still don't know. "Daniel was telling us you've been considering cutting back at work," Patrice said, reaching for the bread. "I think that's wise. Claire, Emma is at such a formative age." "I haven't made any decisions," I said. "But you've been discussing it," Patrice said, looking at Daniel. "We've been talking," Daniel said, in a tone I had learned meant, "Align yourself with me right now." I looked at him across the table. "I don't think I said I was considering it." There was a pause. Patrice set down her bread, Robert cut his chicken with focused attention. "You know," Daniel said lightly to his parents, as if I had not spoken, "Claire's always been the kind of person who has to be the smartest one in the room. It's something we're working on." Robert laughed, a short, uncomfortable sound. Patrice smiled. I said nothing. I served myself more pasta and I did not look at Daniel for the rest of the dinner. And later, when his parents had gone home, he told me I was too sensitive and that he'd been joking around. I did not cry. I went to bed and I lay in the dark and I thought, this is the second time. The third scene. April 2019. Daniel had recently hired a new bookkeeper at Holt Brennan named Marcus, whom he mentioned more than seemed warranted in the early weeks of Marcus's employment. I didn't think much of it then. What I did think about was the moment at Easter dinner. 22 people, including Patrice's bridge club friends, Suzanne, the perpetual guest, and 2 families from the neighborhood who had been invited because Patrice believed in full tables. During the main course, someone asked me about my work. I mentioned a patient I'd been treating, anonymized, as I always kept those stories, a 7-year-old boy recovering from a traumatic brain injury. I described the small breakthrough we'd had that week. The boy had written his name for the first time in 4 months. "Claire's very good at the small victories," Daniel said to the table. "It's a lovely quality. She doesn't need the big ones." Laughter. Warm, easy, friendly laughter from people who thought they'd been given a compliment to pass on my behalf. I smiled. I said, "Exactly right." But my hands were flat on my thighs under the table, pressing into the fabric of my slacks. And I was thinking, what kind of man says something like that to his wife in front of 22 people and calls it a compliment? The fourth scene is the one I return to most often. June 2020. The pandemic had reshuffled everything. My caseload had shifted to telehealth, Daniel was working from home, Emma was 5 and doing kindergarten over a laptop at the kitchen table. We were in the house together more than we had ever been, and the particular texture of our marriage, the dynamic I had accepted as normal, became impossible to ignore. In the middle of June, I asked Daniel for the login to our investment accounts. I framed it practically. I was applying for a professional liability insurance policy and needed to verify our net worth. He said he'd handle it. I said I needed to do it myself. He said he'd handle it, and his voice carried the particular flatness that meant, "This is not a discussion." I waited 2 days and then I looked on his desk for the account statements. I found the most recent one, a Fidelity brokerage statement from May, and I saw a balance I did not expect. $214,000. The account had been opened in 2014. Before our marriage, the last transaction listed was a withdrawal of $4,200 in April. Before that, a withdrawal of $4,200 in March, and in February and in January. I put the statement back exactly where I found it. That night, I lay in bed next to my husband and I understood, with the specific clarity that comes from finally asking the question you've been too afraid to form, that something was wrong. I didn't know how wrong. I didn't know what I was about to find. But I knew I had been kept in the dark on purpose, and I knew that the dark was larger than I'd thought. I need to tell you about Dale Fitch before I tell you what happened that Sunday in March of 2021. Dale had been Daniel's personal accountant for 3 years before he became our joint accountant, which is to say that Dale's first loyalty, his professional origin story in our marriage, was to Daniel. He was a CPA out of a small office on Route 9 in Marwick, meticulous, quiet, and the kind of man who communicated good news and bad news in exactly the same tone, which I came to deeply respect. He wore New Balance sneakers to every appointment I ever had with him and carried a briefcase that was older than our marriage. He came to the house that March morning because Daniel had requested an in-person review of our tax documents. Patrice and Robert were visiting for the weekend. Emma was eating cereal at the counter. The kitchen table held coffee cups, a plate of pastries from a bakery on Main Street, and Dale's open briefcase, from which he had produced a set of documents I had never seen before. What I had found, over the preceding 8 months of quiet and systematic searching, was this. A secondary checking account at First Midwest Bank opened in Daniel's name alone in March of 2014, 14 months before our wedding. Monthly transfers into this account, ranging from $1,800 to $2,400, originating from our joint account. For 7 years. A total, as of February 2021, of approximately $178,000 transferred in, and withdrawals, mostly cash, some by check made out to a name I did not recognize, that accounted for nearly all of it. I had not confronted Daniel with this. I had gathered. I had documented. I had made photocopies and photographs and stored them in a folder on a cloud account Daniel did not know I had, using an email address created on my work laptop during lunch breaks. I had also, 3 months before that Sunday morning, made an appointment with a family law attorney in Columbus named Marguerite Hollis. I knew what the account meant. I had known for several months. But on that Sunday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with his parents 8 feet away and our daughter behind me, I needed to understand what Daniel intended to do with the truth. That was when he said it. "You know what your problem is, Claire. You've always thought you were smarter than you actually are. The numbers don't lie. I do." He said it with a laugh in his voice, the way a man says something he believes but wants to be able to call a joke. He was looking at Dale when he said it. Dale looked at his briefcase. Patrice set down her coffee cup. Robert looked at the window. Emma looked up from her cereal bowl. I said, "You're right, Daniel. The numbers don't lie." And then I stood up, told Emma I was going to get her shoes so we could take a walk, and I left the kitchen. What happened next, I had already decided 3 months earlier. In the hallway, I stood still for approximately 10 seconds. I could hear Daniel's voice from the kitchen, resuming some pleasantry with Dale about estimated quarterly payments. I could hear the familiar clink of Patrice's rings. Against her coffee mug, I could hear Emma say something to Robert, and Robert laugh, the real kind, not the obligatory kind. I was not angry. I want to be precise about this. There is a version of this story where the protagonist has a dramatic internal breakdown, where the tears come, where the hands shake. That is not what happened. What I felt was the specific, lightless calm of someone who has been preparing for a moment and has now arrived at it. I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed. I took my phone from my pocket and I sent a text message to one person, my mother. "Are you free this week? I need to sit with you for a few hours." She replied in 4 minutes, "Tuesday, I'll make soup." I went back downstairs. I got Emma's shoes from the mudroom. I helped her put them on. We walked 2 blocks down Linden Creek Road to the small park where she liked the climbing structure shaped like a boat. She climbed. I sat on the bench. I watched her and I thought, with absolute clarity, this is the last spring I will live in that house. I was right. That afternoon, when Patrice and Robert had gone and Emma was napping, Daniel asked me if I was still upset about the thing at breakfast. I said I wasn't upset. He said I was being distant. I said I was tired. He said, "Sometimes I don't know how to reach you, Claire." And I heard in his voice the beginning of a monologue I had heard 30 or 40 times before about my emotional unavailability, about the way I withdrew instead of engaging, about how he was always the one trying. I said, "I know." He looked at me for a moment. Then he went back to his phone. I went to the kitchen and I made dinner, and I thought about Marguerite Hollis, and about the folder on the cloud account, and about a woman named Stacy Drennan, whose name appeared on 7 checks drawn from Daniel's secondary account between 2017 and 2019. I had already looked her up. I already knew what I would find. But knowing a thing and being ready to use it are 2 different kinds of preparation. I was not ready yet. I needed 3 more months. What I found in those 3 months would make the case not just against my husband, but against a system of concealment so deliberate that a federal civil examiner would later describe it in court as among the more methodical financial deceptions I have encountered in 17 years of forensic review. That review had not begun yet, but I had already lit the match. Tuesday came. I drove to Akron with Emma, and while Emma watched a movie on the tablet, I sat at my mother's kitchen table and I laid out what I had. My mother listened without interrupting. This is one of her finest qualities. She listens the way you want a doctor to listen, with her full face, without preparing her response. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long have you known?" "Clearly," I said. 8 months in the background of my mind, longer. She nodded. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to keep Emma for a few days at the end of April while I meet with the attorney again. And I need you to not tell anyone. Not Aunt Rosa. Not anyone." "Done," she said. I drove back to Marwick with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The attorney, Marguerite Hollis, had offices in a building on High Street in Columbus that smelled of good coffee and neutral carpet. She was 47, efficient without being cold, and she had spent 15 years in family law with a specialty in cases involving financial fraud between spouses. When I first met her in December 2020, I came with a manila folder containing 6 bank statements, a handwritten timeline, and a list of questions. She looked at my materials for 4 minutes without speaking. Then she looked at me and said, "Mr. Maddox, I think we need a forensic accountant." The forensic accountant she referred me to was a woman named Patricia Wren, CPA CFF certified in financial forensics, who operated out of Columbus and charged $285 per hour for her services. I paid for her from money I had been setting aside for 8 months in a savings account, opened in my name only at a different bank. I had deposited $200 per week, every week, since June of 2020, skimming it not from the joint account but from a side income I had been receiving for consulting work I'd begun doing for a telehealth platform. Income I had decided, quietly and deliberately, not to mention to Daniel. By the time Patricia Wren began her work in February 2021, I had $9,200 in that account. Patricia Wren's findings, delivered to Marguerite Hollis in a written report dated April 14, 2021, ran to 47 pages. Here is what she found. The secondary account at First Midwest Bank account, no, ending in 4,471, had received 84 separate transfers from our joint account over the preceding 7 years. The transfers averaged $1,943 per month. The total sum transferred was $163,212. This was the account I had found the statement for, but it was not the only account. Patricia identified a second account, a money market account at a different institution, Crestline Financial, opened in August 2015, 2 months after our wedding. That had received 23 wire transfers from the First Midwest account, over 4 years, totaling $48,400. This account was held under a business entity, a limited liability company called DNS Property Holdings LLC, that Daniel had registered in the state of Ohio in 2015. I was not listed as a member or owner. I had never heard its name. DNS Property Holdings LLC had, in 2016, purchased a residential property at 441 Birchwood Lane in Kettering, Ohio, 40 miles from Marwick. The purchase price was $187,000. The LLC had made 59 monthly mortgage payments on this property, totaling $112,006. The property's current assessed value, as of January 2021, was $211,000. Patricia had also traced a series of payments made by check and ACH transfer from account 4,471 to an individual named Stacy Drennan. These payments began in August of 2015. They totaled $94,350 over 6 years. Stacy Drennan was listed on the deed of 441 Birchwood Lane as a co-occupant. A public records search revealed that she had a daughter, born in January of 2016. The daughter's birth certificate listed her father as Daniel R. Maddox. I read that page 3 times. I set the report on Marguerite's desk. I looked at the window, which had a view of a parking garage on High Street. "How do you want to proceed?" Marguerite asked. "What are my options?" She walked me through them. Ohio is an equitable distribution state, meaning marital assets are divided fairly rather than evenly, and the court has broad discretion to consider economic misconduct. The hidden accounts, the LLC, the property, all of this qualified as dissipation of marital assets, which Ohio courts take seriously. The child born to Stacy Drennan would trigger paternity proceedings and potential child support obligations, which would be calculated against Daniel's total income. The LLC property was subject to division as a marital asset because it had been funded largely through joint account. Transfers made during the marriage, regardless of how it was titled. "There's one more thing," Patricia had noted in her report. The summary line at the bottom of page 46 read, "Total funds diverted from joint marital assets to undisclosed accounts and obligations. Estimated $1,386,764. including transferred funds, property equity, and direct payments to the undisclosed household. $1,386,764. Nearly $1.5 million. 7 years. I thought about every time Daniel had told me the balance of the joint account. I thought about the visa with the $3,000 limit. I thought about the way he'd looked at Dale Fitch and said the numbers. Don't lie. I thought about what I needed to do next, and I did it. What I did next was methodical and quiet. I asked Marguerite to begin filing. I asked her not to contact Daniel's employer yet. That would come, but not yet. I called Patricia Wren and authorized her to prepare a second, more detailed report that would include a chronological transaction log and a cross-reference to Daniel's W-2s for each year to establish that the transfers could not have been funded without income concealment. Patricia found it. Beginning in 2016, Daniel had been receiving an annual consulting stipend from Holt Brennan Supply, $18,000 per year, processed as a $1,099 payment to a separate EIN that was never deposited into our joint account. He had filed it on a separate Schedule C as income to D&S Property Holdings LLC over 4 years. This represented $72,000 in income that existed in our marriage and never appeared in our shared finances. The IRS had not been notified about the LLC's rental income from the Birchwood property. That was a separate problem for Daniel. Not my problem, but relevant context. I want to pause here, because this is where people sometimes ask me, how were you so calm? How did you do all of this without confronting him, without breaking, without giving yourself away? The honest answer is that I had Emma. When you have a child and you are planning to upend her entire world, you do not have the luxury of falling apart on schedule. You do the work. You build the case. You eat dinner across the table from the man who has been living a second life for 7 years and you say, "How was your day?" And you listen to the answer, and you file it away and you wait. And you call your mother on Tuesday nights. And sometimes she says nothing and you say nothing and you just breathe on the phone together while Emma watches something in the next room. That was enough. The filing was submitted to the Franklin County Court of Common Pleas, Domestic Relations Division, on May 3, 2021. Daniel was served at the Holt Brennan Supply offices on May 7th at 10:14 in the morning by a process server named Kevin who wore a blue polo shirt. I know the time because I was in the parking lot of Emma's school waiting for pickup when Marguerite texted me, "Served." Emma came out the front door of the school carrying a drawing she'd made of our house. She got in the car and showed it to me and said, "Does it look right?" "It looks exactly right," I told her, and I drove home. Daniel came home that evening at 6:47. I know the time because I noted it. Emma was already at my mother's in Akron. I had driven her there the night before, told her it was a special sleepover, and she had been delighted. I was alone in the house on Linden Creek Road for the first time I could remember. He walked in through the garage. He stood in the kitchen doorway holding the envelope. He looked at me. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where he had said what he said to Dale Fitch, with a cup of tea and my hands folded on the surface. He said, "What is this?" "It's a divorce petition," I said. The silence lasted approximately 8 seconds. "Claire is sitting." "Don't," I said, not loudly, just precisely. "You have an attorney. Call them." I want to be honest about what happened next because I think the honest version is more important than the version where I appear perfectly composed, he argued. He went through the phases, denial first, then anger, then a kind of reframing where the other woman was something that had just happened, where the money was being held for our future, where I had forced his hand by being someone he could not talk to. He raised his voice. He put his hand flat on the table. He told me I was destroying our family. I said, "Daniel, I know about Birchwood Lane. I know about Stacy. I know about the baby. I know about D&S Property Holdings, and I know about the $1,386,764. Your attorney will explain what happens next." He went still, the specific stillness of someone whose story has just become unworkable. Then he picked up his keys and he left. I drank my tea. The court proceedings began in July of 2021 and extended, because of the financial complexity and a request for forensic review by the court itself, through April of 2022. What happened in those 9 months deserves its own account. but I want to focus on the moments that mattered most. The first was the deposition of Dale Fitch, which took place on September 15, 2021, in a conference room at Marguerite's office. Dale arrived in his New Balance sneakers. He was, as always, precise. Under questioning from Marguerite, Dale confirmed that he had been aware, since 2018, of the existence of DNS Property Holdings LLC and had prepared the Schedule C filings for that entity on Daniel's behalf. He had not known about the transfers from the joint account. He had not known about Stacey Drennan. He had prepared Daniel's personal taxes without disclosure of the LLC's connection to the marriage's shared finances. Dale was not charged with anything, but he testified under oath that Daniel had specifically instructed him, in 2018, to keep the LLC filings separate, and that Daniel had told him I was aware of the business and not involved in its management. That lie, told by Daniel to his own accountant, was now part of the court record. The second moment was the testimony of Patricia Wren, who appeared before the Domestic Relations Court on February 8, 2022. She presented her findings, the full 47-page report, a 1-2-page chronological transaction summary, and 3 financial exhibits in testimony that lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. She spoke about the 7 years of transfers. She spoke about the LLC. She spoke about the Birchwood Lane property. She spoke about the $1,099 income. And she said, on the record, in front of the magistrate, in front of Daniel and his attorney, in front of Patrice and Robert, who had come to court that day and sat in the gallery 3 rows back. In 17 years of forensic financial review, the pattern of concealment in this case, the breadth, the duration, and the deliberateness of it, is among the more methodical I have encountered. Daniel's attorney objected to characterizations. The magistrate overruled. I watched Patrice Maddox's face when Patricia said that. She was sitting very straight, in a blue blazer, with her hands folded in her lap. When Patricia finished the sentence, Patrice looked down at her hands. It was one precise, restrained moment, a woman understanding that the story she had told herself about her son was not the story in the room. The third moment was the ruling. On April 4, 2022, the court issued its findings. The ruling was 31 pages. The key determinations were as follows. All assets of D&S Property Holdings LLC, including the Birchwood Lane property, valued at $211,000, and all cash holdings in the LLC's Crestline financial account, totaling $39,200 at time of filing, were determined to be marital assets and subject to equitable distribution. The $163,212 in documented transfers from the joint account to account 4,471 was classified as economic misconduct, and the court adjusted the asset division accordingly, a determination that functionally added those funds back to my share of the marital estate. Daniel was ordered to pay me $487,000 as a property settlement, structured over 30 months, with the Linden Creek Roadhouse as primary security. Daniel was ordered to pay $2,340 per month in child support for Emma. Daniel was ordered to pay $1,800 per month in spousal support for 4 years. A separate paternity proceeding in Montgomery County had already established Daniel's legal parentage of the child born to Stacey Drennan, a 2-year-old girl named Lena, and a child support order of $1,600 per month was entered in that case. Simultaneously, the total of Daniel's court-ordered monthly obligations was $5,740. His monthly take-home pay, after taxes and benefits, was approximately $7,100. His attorney requested a modification. The court declined. I did not smile when I heard the ruling. I want to be clear about that. I sat next to Marguerite at the counsel table and I listened to the magistrate read the determinations, and I felt the quiet relief of someone who has been carrying weight for a long time and has been permitted to set it down. Afterward, in the hallway, Patrice found me. She was alone. Robert was with Daniel, who had gone outside. She stood in front of me in her blue blazer and she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't know about the child." I said, "I know you didn't, Patrice." She said nothing else. She turned and walked to the elevator. I watched her go. There was no apology, but there was no argument either. from Patrice Maddox in that hallway. That was the most I had ever received. The IRS matter resolved separately. In late 2022, Daniel entered into an installment agreement for back taxes and penalties, totaling $31,400, arising from the unreported LLC rental income across 6 years. That was his problem to manage. But it meant that by the end of 2022, Daniel Maddox was paying 5 parties: me, Emma's support account, Stacey Drennan's household, the IRS, and his attorney, from a salary that had not changed in 2 years. Holt Brennan Supply conducted an internal review following disclosure of the financial proceedings. The consulting stipend arrangement, through which $72,000 had been paid to the LLC EIN over 4 years, was determined to have violated company policy on conflicts of interest. Daniel resigned from Holt Brennan in November 2022, 11 months after the divorce was finalized. He relocated to the Kettering area, where Stacey and Lena lived. I heard this from Bethany, Daniel's sister, who called me in December 2022 and said, with a gentleness I had not expected from her, "I just wanted you to know I'm sorry for how things went. Not what happened in court, for all of it." I thanked her. I meant it. The house on Linden Creek Road was sold in September 2022. We agreed to list it, split the equity after the mortgage payoff, and use the proceeds as the first tranche of the property settlement. The equity came to $138,000 after fees and payoff, which was split equally. My $69,000 went into the account that was becoming, slowly and deliberately, my rebuilt financial foundation. Emma and I moved to a 2-bedroom apartment on Walnut Street in Marwick, 5 blocks from her elementary school. The apartment had tall ceilings and original wood floors, and a kitchen window that looked out over a small courtyard. Emma chose yellow curtains for her room. We hung them on a Saturday morning with a tension rod and a step stool, and she stood back and said, "Perfect," with the absolute conviction of a 7-year-old who knows what she wants. I thought about that house on Linden Creek Road, the wide porch and the cedar mudroom and the photographs on the wall. I thought about what I had loved about it and what it had cost me, and I thought, this window is better. Daniel paid the property settlement as ordered, though the 3rd monthly tranche arrived 11 days late and required Marguerite to send a compliance notice. He paid the child support consistently, which I will acknowledge because accuracy matters. He paid the spousal support for 14 months before petitioning for modification, citing his change in employment. The court reduced it by $400 per month for the remaining terms. My mother came to the new apartment for Christmas that first year. She brought her soup and a small tree she'd bought at a hardware store, and a present for Emma that Emma opened in approximately 4 seconds flat. After Emma was asleep, my mother and I sat at the kitchen table with tea, and she looked at me for a long time and then said, "You look like yourself." I didn't know until she said it how much I had not looked like myself. Robert Maddox called me once, about a year after the divorce was finalized. He asked how Emma was. I told him she was well. He said, "I'm glad you had someone in your corner." It was the most personal thing he had ever said to me in 8 years. I thanked him. We have not spoken since, though he sends Emma a birthday card every year with a $20 bill inside. And Emma puts the 20 in a jar she has designated for special things. Patrice has not called. I do not expect her to. Dale Fitch reached out to me in the spring of 2022 through Marguerite to express what Marguerite described as professional remorse for his role in the situation. He did not have a legal obligation to me. What he had was a conscience, and it appears he needed to use it. I told Marguerite to tell him I understood and that I held no personal grievance toward him. That was true. Stacey Drennan, I have thought about her more than I have thought about Daniel. She was 26 when her daughter was born. She was 29 when the divorce proceedings began. She had been told, I later learned, through the course of the litigation, not through any direct contact, that Daniel was separated from a wife who refused to move on. She had been living in a house purchased with money taken from my marriage. I don't know if she knew where the money came from. The court did not find evidence that she did. What I know is that she was raising a child alone in Kettering by the time Daniel relocated there, and that whatever she was told when things began, she was not given the whole truth either. I did not reach out to her. That is a boundary I kept for Emma's sake and my own. But I thought about her. I thought about how many people one person's concealment can damage, rippling outward from the center in directions the person at the center never fully accounts for. The forensic accounting bill, total $19,740. Marguerite's legal fees, total $34,200. My savings account, which I rebuilt from that $9,200 starting point over the subsequent 3 years, held $67,000 by December 2024. I started a private practice in the spring of 2023, 3 days a week, occupational therapy consultations from a small office I rented in a building 2 streets from Emma's school. By the end of 2023, the practice had 9 clients. By the end of 2024, it had 22 with a wait list. My annual income in 2024 was $94,000, the highest it had ever been. I handle my own finances. It is a Thursday in the early part of the year. Emma is 9. She is in the next room doing homework, asking occasional questions about fractions that I answer from muscle memory while I think about what I want to say here. I want to name what I lost, because I think the naming matters. I lost the house on Linden Creek Road. I lost the version of my marriage I had been trying to sustain. I lost years. Not to Daniel, exactly, but to the particular labor of maintaining a life built on information I was not allowed to have. I lost the uncomplicated relationship I might have had with Robert and Patrice Maddox, people who were not evil, only complicit in the way that people become complicit when love for their child outweighs accountability. I lost the ease of not knowing. There is a specific grief in discovering that the life you thought you were living was adjacent to the life that was actually happening, that another household existed with your money and your husband, last name and your daughter's half-sibling. That grief is real. I do not minimize it. What I gained was harder to list because it did not come with labels. I gained my own finances, fully, irreversibly, with my name on every account and my eyes on every number. I gained a practice I built without anyone's permission. I gained a kitchen window that looks out over a courtyard where Emma likes to kick a ball against the wall on Sunday afternoons. I gained the specific, quiet authority of a woman who knows exactly what she is worth, not the version of worth that requires someone else's validation, but the version that comes from doing the work and having the documentation to prove it. I gained my mother's company at a kitchen table every few weeks. That alone was worth more than the Linden Creek Roadhouse. What I now understand is this. The man who says the numbers don't lie is often the man most afraid of what the numbers say. Control of financial information in a marriage is not administrative convenience. It is power. I accepted that arrangement because I was raised to believe that acceptance was a form of wisdom. It was not. It was a substitution. I traded access for harmony, and harmony was the thing I never actually had. I would not make that trade again. There are women and men, and people who contain multitudes, sitting at kitchen tables right now, in houses that smell like cedar and someone else's decisions, nodding at numbers they are not allowed to verify. If this story stays with you, you can follow along here, and I'd be glad to hear what you took from it in the comments. My name is Claire Maddox. I am 39 years old. I have an occupational therapy practice with a waitlist, a 9-year-old who picks yellow curtains and understands fractions better than I do, and a savings account that bears only my name. That is who I am. That is what I built from the wreckage. The numbers don't lie. I know that now better than he ever did.